How the West Brought War to Ukraine. This video is based on key insights from the book How the West Brought War to Ukraine by Benjamin Abelow. Introduction. Benjamin Abelow begins by pointing out a shift in how the United States explains its involvement in the war in Ukraine. Initially, the focus was on helping Ukraine defend itself, but the goal has grown to include weakening Russia's military strength for the long term. Abelow suggests this longer-term goal might have been the plan all along, noting that even early in the conflict, observers like Chas Freeman believed the U.S. was aiming to prolong the fighting, even at a great cost to Ukrainian lives. This creates a problem. Helping Ukraine quickly versus weakening Russia requires a long, destructive war. The author explains that this new U.S. strategy puts America in a direct conflict with Russia, aiming to damage its military. Billions of dollars in aid, intelligence helping to eliminate Russian generals, and even assisting attacks inside Russia demonstrate this shift. Other countries, like Britain, are encouraging Ukraine to strike deeper into Russian territory. This escalation hasn't gone unnoticed by Russia, which has made warnings about using nuclear weapons, even raising its military alert level. While Western media often dismisses these warnings, Abelow points out the U.S. military also raised its alert status in response to Putin's announcement, bringing both countries closer to a dangerous, hair-trigger situation where a mistake could lead to nuclear war. Abelow then considers what might happen if Russia starts to lose badly. He argues that if Russia feels its very existence is threatened, it might use smaller nuclear weapons on the battlefield to try and stop an invasion. This concern was even voiced by the U.S. Director of National Intelligence, who stated Putin might use nuclear weapons if he believes Russia is facing an existential threat. The author emphasizes the irony. The U.S. policy of weakening Russia could actually increase the risk of nuclear war. He also addresses the idea of regime change in Russia, where the U.S. and its allies might hope to replace Putin with a leader more friendly to Western interests. Abelow cautions against this, pointing out Russia has a large nuclear arsenal, and a new leader might be even more unpredictable and dangerous. The core of Abelow's argument is that this entire situation stems from a flawed Western understanding of Russia and its motivations. He believes the West views Putin as simply an aggressive leader wanting to expand Russia's territory, similar to Hitler. This narrative justifies a policy of confrontation. However, Abelow argues this narrative is wrong. He believes the war isn't about unprovoked Russian expansionism, but rather a result of decades of actions by the West that have pushed Russia into a corner. He specifically singles out the United States as playing the most important role in creating this situation. Abelow clarifies he isn't trying to excuse Russia's invasion or defend Putin. He wants to understand the reasons behind Putin's actions, to figure out what led him to believe war was the only option. He acknowledges that NATO expansion is often mentioned as a contributing factor, but argues it's not the whole story. The author contends the U.S. has taken many provocative actions beyond just expanding NATO, actions that have consistently threatened Russia's security. Abelow then previews a list of specific Western actions he will detail in the book. These include expanding NATO eastward despite previous assurances to Russia, placing missile systems in Eastern Europe that could also launch nuclear weapons, supporting a coup in Ukraine that replaced a pro-Russian government with a pro-Western one, conducting military exercises near Russia's borders, pushing for Ukraine to join NATO despite Russian concerns, withdrawing from arms control treaties, and heavily arming and training the Ukrainian military. He stresses the seriousness of the situation, arguing that because of the long history, the potential for nuclear war, and the immense stakes involved, it's crucial to understand what happened and why. The author plans to present a step-by-step analysis of these events, starting with the period after the fall of the Soviet Union and continuing through the present day. He will also explore what might have happened if the West had chosen a different path. Chapter 1, Western Provocations, 1992-014. Benjamin Abelow details a history where actions by Western countries, particularly the United States, contributed to growing tensions with Russia, ultimately building toward the current crisis and raising the frightening possibility of a larger war, even one involving nuclear weapons. The story begins after the Soviet Union started to fall apart around 1990. Western leaders wanted to bring East and West Germany together as one country, and they wanted this new Germany to be part of NATO, a military alliance led by the United States. To get Russia's agreement, they suggested that NATO wouldn't expand further east toward Russia's borders. However, Abelow explains, these weren't official promises written down in treaties. Instead, they were assurances given in conversations between leaders. Despite this, NATO began to grow, adding countries from Eastern Europe as members. Researchers, like those at the National Security Archive, found documents showing that Western leaders did give assurances to Russia about NATO not expanding. These weren't just made-up stories by Russia, but were actually recorded in notes from high-level meetings. Another researcher, Joshua Shifrinson, found similar evidence, stating that the U.S. appeared to mislead the Soviet Union about its intentions. Abelow stresses he isn't saying these assurances were legally binding, but that the West's actions created a feeling of distrust in Russia. The expansion continued, and in 1999, Poland was admitted into NATO. A retired Army colonel, Douglas MacGregor, pointed out that Russia was worried, not necessarily because NATO was hostile at the time, but because Poland had a long history of being unfriendly toward Russia. This raised concerns that Poland could potentially start a conflict. Further expansion occurred in 2004 with the addition of Romania and Estonia, bringing NATO even closer to Russia's borders, over 600 miles closer. Abelow highlights a particularly important moment in 2008. At a NATO meeting, the alliance announced it wanted Ukraine and Georgia to become members. These countries both share borders with Russia. While some European countries were hesitant, the U.S. pushed strongly for this, stating that Ukraine and Georgia would eventually join NATO. Russia saw this as a major threat. A U.S. ambassador to Russia, William Burns, sent a cable back to Washington warning that Russia considered this a red line, something they wouldn't tolerate. He wrote that Russia felt surrounded and feared the consequences of Ukraine and Georgia joining NATO. Just months later, in 2008, Russia went to war with Georgia. Abelow explains that while the immediate cause was a Georgian attack on a region within Georgia that had close ties to Russia, the larger reason was Russia's concern about Western military power moving closer to its borders. MacGregor believes Russia's actions in Georgia were a signal to the U.S. that they wouldn't allow NATO members on their borders, especially those that were unfriendly. The situation escalated further in 2014 with protests in Ukraine. Abelow argues that these protests were taken over by violent groups, leading to a coup where the pro-Russian president was forced out of power. The U.S. had invested a lot of money in supporting pro-democracy groups in Ukraine and was involved in discussions about who would replace the president. A leaked phone call between U.S. officials revealed they were actively planning the new government. Russia saw this as the U.S. interfering in Ukraine and, fearing the loss of access to its naval base in Crimea, annexed the region. Abelow points out that this annexation wasn't a long-planned move, but rather a reaction to the coup. He also notes that Western leaders then blamed Russia for being aggressive, rather than acknowledging their own role in creating the crisis. Abelow concludes that the West's actions, from expanding NATO to supporting a change in government in Ukraine, created a situation where Russia felt threatened and responded in ways that have led to the current conflict and increased the risk of a much larger, potentially nuclear, war. He emphasizes that while Russia's actions are concerning, understanding the history of Western policies is crucial to understanding the current crisis. Chapter 2, Western Provocations, 2014-2022. Benjamin Abelow argues that the story of the war in Ukraine isn't as simple as many people think. He believes that actions taken by Western countries, particularly the United States and NATO, played a significant role in creating the conditions that led to the crisis, the war, and the scary possibility of a nuclear conflict. It's a complex situation, and Abelow challenges the idea that Russia's actions came completely out of the blue. He points out that many in the West claim there were no new actions that provoked Russia after 2014, but he strongly disagrees. Abelow explains that after Russia took control of Crimea in 2014, the U.S. started sending Ukraine a lot of money for military help, over $4 billion. This wasn't just about giving Ukraine things they needed. It was also about making their military work better with NATO, even though Ukraine wasn't a member of NATO at the time. This is like helping a friend practice with a sports team they aren't officially on yet, but it still makes them closer to the team. A particularly concerning development, according to Abelow, was the installation of missile defense systems in Romania in 2016. These systems were presented as being there to protect Europe from missiles launched by countries like Iran or North Korea. However, Abelow highlights that the launchers used in these systems, called Aegis, could also fire missiles with nuclear warheads that could reach Moscow. He compares it to having a tool that can build houses, but could also be used to cause damage. Russia saw this as a direct threat, even if the U.S. said it wouldn't use them offensively. The U.S. asked Russia to trust their intentions, but Abelow points out that Russia was right to be worried about the potential of the system, not just what the U.S. said it would do. The situation escalated further when the U.S. began selling Ukraine more powerful weapons in 2017, including weapons that could be used to attack, not just defend. Abelow explains that what counts as offensive or defensive can depend on who you ask. To Ukraine, these weapons might seem defensive, but to Russia, they looked like a threat. Then, in 2019, the U.S. decided to leave a treaty that limited the development of certain types of nuclear missiles, which further worried Russia. Abelow also notes that it wasn't just the U.S. involved. Other NATO countries also started helping Ukraine by providing weapons, training soldiers, and participating in military exercises together. One exercise in the Black Sea in 2021 almost led to a conflict when a British ship entered waters that Russia considered its own. Meanwhile, NATO was conducting its own military exercises near Russia's borders, including simulated attacks on targets inside Russia. Abelow emphasizes that Russia wouldn't just assume these were harmless simulations. They would consider the actual capability of the weapons and where they were located. Throughout this period, NATO continued to say that Ukraine would eventually become a member of the alliance. Abelow argues that this, combined with the military activities, sent a clear message to Russia that the West was actively working to bring Ukraine closer to NATO, despite Russia's concerns. The U.S. and Ukraine even signed agreements to strengthen their military cooperation, further solidifying this trend. Abelow cites John Mearsheimer, a political scientist, who explains that Russia felt it had reached a breaking point. Russia tried to get guarantees from the U.S. and NATO that Ukraine would never join NATO, and that NATO would remove its military presence from Eastern Europe. But the U.S. refused to make those guarantees. As a result, Russia felt it had no choice but to invade Ukraine to try to eliminate what it saw as a growing threat. Abelow concludes that the West's actions created a situation where Russia felt increasingly cornered and insecure, ultimately leading to the war and raising the risk of a much larger conflict. Chapter 3, Putting the Shoe on the Other Foot. Benjamin Abelow argues that the current crisis with Russia and the danger of a big war isn't just Russia's fault. He believes that the way the West, especially the United States, has acted over the last 30 years has actually made things worse and pushed Russia into a corner. He asks a simple but powerful question. How would the U.S. react if another country did the same things to us that we've been doing to Russia? Abelow paints a picture of what that might look like. Imagine Russia making friends with Canada and putting rockets just 70 miles from the U.S. border. Then, imagine those rockets practicing hitting targets inside America. Would the U.S. just accept Russia's promises that everything is okay? Of course not. The US would see this as a huge threat, possibly preparing to attack those rockets first, which could quickly lead to a much bigger, even nuclear, war. And Abelow points out, the US would likely believe it was right to defend itself, even if it started the attack. This is the core of his argument. We wouldn't tolerate this behavior from another country, so why do we expect Russia to tolerate it from us? For almost 200 years, the United States has had a rule, called the Monroe Doctrine, that says other powerful countries shouldn't have armies close to America. Abelow says this shows the US understands that where armies are located matters a lot, no matter what those countries say their intentions are. But he argues, the US doesn't follow this rule when it comes to Russia. Instead, the US has pulled out of agreements to limit weapons, supported changes in governments near Russia's borders, and moved its own armies closer and closer to Russia, all while saying it's just trying to keep the peace. Abelow believes the US doesn't think about how Russia might feel or how these actions might make Russia react. He references Colonel MacGregor, who explains that Ukraine is incredibly important to Russia, much like Mexico would be to the United States. Abelow then looks back at the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. Everyone remembers how the US stood up to the Soviet Union when they put missiles in Cuba. But he reveals a secret part of that story. At the same time, the US had missiles in Turkey, pointed at Russia. The crisis ended when both countries agreed to remove their missiles. The US quietly took its missiles out of Turkey a few months later. Many people in the West thought the US won the crisis by being tough, but Abelow says that's not the whole story. It was a compromise, made possible because the US and Soviet leaders had a good relationship and could talk to each other. He notes that things are very different now, and those kinds of relationships are missing. Finally, Abelow addresses the question of promises made to Russia about NATO. After the Soviet Union fell apart, there was talk about whether NATO, the military alliance between the US and other Western countries, would expand eastward. Some people say the West promised Russia that NATO wouldn't get closer to its borders. Others say no such promises were made, or that any promises weren't legally binding. Abelow argues that whether or not formal promises were made isn't the most important thing. What matters is that Russia felt like it was misled and disrespected. This created a lack of trust that has only gotten worse over time. Abelow concludes that it doesn't matter if the threats to Russia came from NATO expanding or from other countries working with the West. The important thing is that Russia feels threatened. He asks us to think about how any country would react if it felt its survival was at risk. He wants readers to understand that to understand the current situation, we need to consider what Russia is seeing and feeling, and how Western actions have contributed to the crisis. Chapter 4: Russian Concerns about a U.S. First Strike. Benjamin Abelow details how actions taken by the United States, particularly regarding nuclear weapons treaties and missile deployments, contributed to escalating tensions with Russia and potentially increased the risk of conflict, ultimately playing a role in the crisis leading to the war in Ukraine. In 2019, the U.S. decided to leave a treaty called the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces (INF) Treaty, which had been in place since the Cold War. This treaty limited the number of missiles each country could have that could travel a medium distance. The U.S. claimed Russia wasn't following the rules, but Abelow points out that both sides had reasons to believe the other was bending the treaty. However, instead of trying to fix the problem together, the U.S. simply pulled out. Abelow argues this wasn't just about the treaty itself. The U.S. may have seen a chance to gain an advantage, especially against China, which wasn't limited by the treaty. The author explains that placing these missiles in Europe, close to Russia, would give the U.S. a strategic position. But this move worried Russia, as it felt vulnerable to a surprise attack. Imagine someone building a strong military base right next to your house. You'd probably feel uneasy, right? Russia feared the U.S. might think it could knock out Russia's ability to fight back with a quick strike, especially if combined with missile defense systems designed to shoot down incoming attacks. The author highlights that Russia tried to find a solution, suggesting both countries agree not to place these new missiles anywhere. But the US didn't even respond to the offer. Instead, the US military started arguing about who would get to control these new missiles, showing they were already planning to use them. This disregard for Russia's concerns, as Abelow explains, fueled fears in Moscow that the US was no longer interested in avoiding a dangerous arms race. It was like ignoring someone's warnings and continuing a course of action that clearly made them anxious. Abelow notes that President Putin repeatedly voiced his worries about these potential missile deployments, but his concerns were largely dismissed. The author suggests that this situation was one of many factors that led to the invasion of Ukraine. Putin may have believed he needed to act quickly to prevent the US from placing offensive weapons in Ukraine, even if Ukraine wasn't yet part of NATO. He might have felt the opportunity to stop this from happening was slipping away. Abelow emphasizes that while it's impossible to know exactly what motivated Putin, the threat of new missile systems definitely added to the already tense situation, pushing it closer to the breaking point. The author concludes that the US focus on its own advantages, without considering the potential consequences for Russia, contributed to a dangerous escalation that ultimately played a role in the outbreak of war. Chapter 5. Policy experts warned against NATO expansion. Benjamin Abelow's chapter dives into a really important and often overlooked part of the story behind the conflict in Ukraine: how the actions of the West, specifically the expansion of NATO, might have actually contributed to the crisis. For 30 years, smart people who study international relations have been warning that pushing NATO eastward into Eastern Europe was a risky move. These weren't just random critics. They were serious players like George Kennan, a key figure in shaping US policy during the Cold War. Kennan believed that expanding NATO after the Soviet Union fell apart was a huge mistake, wondering why everyone was so focused on building alliances against someone when the Cold War was over and things were looking up. He thought it was setting the stage for a new conflict, and sadly, he seemed to be right. Abelow points out that Kennan wasn't the only one sounding the alarm. Former leaders and experts from across the political spectrum, even some who were known for being tough on Russia, agreed that NATO expansion was a bad idea. Think about Robert McNamara, who made tough decisions during the Vietnam War, or Richard Pipes, a strong anti-communist. These people weren't necessarily friends of Russia, but they understood that constantly pushing NATO closer to Russia's borders would make them feel threatened. They warned that Russia would react negatively and that it could lead to problems. Despite these warnings, the US and NATO continued to expand, adding more and more countries to the alliance. More recently, in 2015, John Mearsheimer predicted that if the West kept trying to pull Ukraine into its orbit, Russia might feel forced to take action, even to the point of destabilizing Ukraine. This prediction, like Kennan's earlier warnings, turned out to be accurate. What's really interesting, Abelow notes, is that even people who are very critical of Russia now seem to admit that NATO expansion played a role in the current situation. Fiona Hill, a former National Security Council expert, acknowledged that Putin warned the West back in 2007 that Russia wouldn't tolerate further NATO expansion. She even said that US intelligence officials recognized before Russia's actions in Crimea that there was a real risk of a military response. Hill explained that the intelligence community thought Russia might even take bigger steps than just annexing Crimea, potentially invading Ukraine and Georgia. She pointed out that Russia did invade Georgia shortly after NATO signaled it might include Ukraine and Georgia in the alliance. The fact that Russia didn't invade Ukraine at that time, she says, was only because Ukraine decided not to pursue NATO membership. This is a crucial point. Russia's actions were, at least in part, a reaction to what they saw as a threat to their security. Abelow highlights that Hill's insights are remarkable because she's known as a Russia hawk, someone who generally takes a hard line against Russia. Yet, she's admitting that the West made mistakes that contributed to the crisis. However, Abelow observes that even when acknowledging the role of NATO expansion, many analysts still frame Putin as an irrational aggressor, comparing him to Hitler. Hill herself, while recognizing the historical context, ultimately portrays Putin as driven by a dangerous expansionism. Abelow finds this confusing because Hill seems to contradict herself. She acknowledges that NATO expansion was a key factor in Putin's thinking, but then dismisses it as irrelevant, attributing his actions to personal motivations and a desire to reclaim lost territory. Abelow points out that Russia has a long history of being invaded, from Napoleon to the Nazis, and that its geography, a vast, flat plain with no natural defenses, makes it particularly vulnerable. He argues that these historical and geographical factors should be considered when understanding Russia's security concerns. Abelow emphasizes that understanding Russia's past is important, especially considering the immense suffering the country endured during World War II, with an estimated 25 million deaths. He suggests that Putin's own family history, marked by loss and hardship during the siege of Leningrad, might contribute to his sensitivity about Russia's security. However, Abelow notes that Hill doesn't seem to connect these personal experiences to broader security concerns, instead framing them as evidence of Putin's irrationality. Ultimately, Abelow argues that while many analysts acknowledge the role of NATO expansion, they often downplay its importance, attributing the crisis solely to Putin's aggression. He suggests that a more nuanced understanding of the situation requires acknowledging the West's role in creating the conditions that led to the conflict, even while condemning Russia's actions. He also points out that those who suggest the West shares responsibility aren't necessarily supporting Putin, but rather recognizing the complex factors at play and the tragic consequences of the war. Chapter 6. Russophobic policy makers double down on past mistakes. Benjamin Abelow argues that the current crisis in Ukraine and the dangerous possibility of a larger war with Russia isn't a surprise. He believes it's a direct result of choices made over many years by the United States and its allies in NATO. Instead of learning from past mistakes, Abelow says those who pushed for certain policies are now claiming the war proves they were right all along, that Russia is simply aggressive and needed to be confronted more strongly. He disagrees, suggesting that experts who warned about the risks of expanding NATO eastward were actually the ones who understood the situation best. Abelow points to George Kennan, a very important American diplomat during the Cold War who predicted exactly this scenario. Kennan warned that expanding NATO, the military alliance between countries in North America and Europe, towards Russia's borders would provoke a negative reaction. He believed it would eventually lead to conflict. What's more, Kennan foresaw that when Russia did react, those who supported NATO expansion would blame Russia's inherent militarism, instead of acknowledging their own role in creating the problem. Abelow notes that Kennan's prediction has come true, with some now claiming Russia's invasion proves Russia is simply an aggressor, ignoring the history of NATO's growth. The author observes that the American media isn't giving much attention to these alternative viewpoints. He suggests that many news sources are focused on the details of the fighting in Ukraine, creating a war fever where people are swept up in anger and a desire to help Ukraine by sending more weapons. This intense focus, Abelow contends, makes it hard to see the bigger picture and understand how the situation developed. He believes this war fever prevents a clear understanding of the historical context. Abelow praises the few American politicians who are willing to openly discuss the background of the conflict, even if it means facing criticism. He argues that these leaders are acting like true patriots by refusing to blindly support their country's actions and instead trying to learn from the past. They want to prevent further death and destruction in Ukraine and avoid a potentially catastrophic nuclear war. He highlights the words of John Mearsheimer, who believes the West is making the situation even more dangerous by trying to severely weaken Russia and potentially remove Putin from power. According to Mearsheimer, Russia sees the conflict not as an attempt to expand its empire, but as a matter of survival. Putin may have miscalculated some aspects of the war, but Abelow emphasizes that powerful countries often act ruthlessly when they feel threatened. The author concludes that the West's current strategy of increasing aid to Ukraine and imposing harsh sanctions on Russia is seen by Putin as a hostile act, potentially escalating the conflict even further. Chapter 7: How Overly Pessimistic Narratives Become Self-Fulfilling Prophecies. Benjamin Abelow argues that the way the West, especially the United States and Europe, has treated Russia over the last 30 years has actually made things worse, leading to the current crisis, the war in Ukraine, and a scary risk of a much bigger war. He believes the common story we hear, that Russia is simply evil and aggressive, isn't the whole truth, and might even be making the situation more dangerous. It's like telling a scary story that then starts to come true because everyone acts as if it already is. Abelow points out that the West has repeatedly taken actions that Russia sees as threatening, and then acts surprised when Russia reacts. He uses the idea of a security dilemma, which is like two neighbors building higher fences around their yards because they're worried about each other. Each fence makes the other neighbor feel less safe, so they build an even higher fence, and so on. Eventually, you have a wall that makes it hard to even talk to each other. This is what happened with NATO, the military alliance between the US and many European countries. It grew bigger and bigger, moving closer and closer to Russia's borders, even though many people, like George Kennan, warned that this would make Russia feel surrounded and scared. Russia didn't feel safer, it felt threatened. The author explains that the West often tells Russia that its fears are silly, and that any military buildup is just for defense. But Abelow argues that this is like telling someone who's worried about being attacked that they're just being paranoid. It's dismissive and doesn't address the real concerns. He even compares it to gaslighting, a form of emotional abuse where someone tries to make another person doubt their own reality. Imagine if your friend kept moving closer and closer to you while saying, "Don't worry, I'm not trying to invade your personal space." You'd probably get pretty uncomfortable and maybe even react defensively. Abelow also believes that the way Western leaders have talked about, and to Vladimir Putin, has been disrespectful and unhelpful. He says that constantly insulting or dismissing someone, even a leader you disagree with, isn't a good way to build trust or find solutions. It's like poking a bear, you're likely to get a negative reaction. He emphasizes that Putin, like everyone, is influenced by what happens around him. If you constantly treat someone with hostility, they're more likely to become hostile in return. The author warns that the constant negativity and fear-mongering in the media, and from politicians, is empowering the people who want more war and conflict. He refers to the military-industrial complex, a term President Eisenhower used to describe the close relationship between the military, weapons manufacturers, and politicians. These groups often benefit from war, so they have a vested interest in keeping tensions high. Abelow believes that this narrative of suspicion is dangerous because it can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. If we believe Russia is our enemy, we'll act like it, and Russia will likely respond in kind, making war more likely. He draws a parallel to World War I, where a series of misunderstandings and escalating tensions led to a devastating conflict. Abelow concludes by saying that Western actions may have even contributed to the problems within Russia itself, like the increasing authoritarianism. He suggests that the constant pressure and perceived threats from the West might have created a sense of siege mentality within Russia, leading to a crackdown on dissent and a more aggressive foreign policy. He points to George Kennan's prediction that NATO expansion would harm the development of Russian democracy. Ultimately, Abelow urges readers to question the dominant narrative and consider the possibility that the West bears some responsibility for the current crisis. Chapter 8: A Counterfactual History and Conclusion. Benjamin Abelow begins by asking a very important question: who is to blame for the terrible situation in Ukraine? He points out the obvious Vladimir Putin started the war and is responsible for the immediate harm. But Abelow argues that simply blaming Putin doesn't tell the whole story. He believes that the United States and European countries also played a big role in creating the conditions that led to the war, and therefore share responsibility for the suffering. Abelow states that figuring out exactly how much blame each side deserves is tricky. There's no easy way to measure responsibility when many people and countries are involved. However, he firmly believes that the West, especially the United States, bears the biggest share of the blame. He uses a thought experiment, a what-if scenario, to make his point. He asks us to imagine what would have happened if the United States had made different choices over the past 30 years. According to Abelow, if the US hadn't kept expanding NATO closer and closer to Russia, hadn't put missile systems in countries like Romania and Poland, and hadn't interfered in Ukraine's government in 2014, the war likely wouldn't have happened. He lists many other actions, stopping important arms control treaties, holding military exercises near Russia's borders, and heavily arming Ukraine, that he believes added to the tension and pushed Russia closer to war. He compares these actions to building a tower of sand. Each action added more instability, making a collapse more likely. He argues that the West knowingly built this unstable situation and shouldn't be surprised that it eventually fell apart. Abelow also suggests that the US may have encouraged Ukraine to take a tough stance against Russia, making it harder to find a peaceful solution. He points to Ukrainian President Zelensky, who was originally elected on a promise of peace. However, the US, Abelow claims, pushed Ukraine to pursue closer ties with the West and refused to consider Ukraine remaining neutral. He notes that Zelensky was even offered a deal where Ukraine would give up its hopes of joining NATO in exchange for security guarantees from Russia and the West, but he turned it down, believing Putin couldn't be trusted. Abelow believes that if the US hadn't given Ukraine unrealistic expectations, Zelensky might have been willing to compromise and avoid war. The author highlights a comment from an expert, Richard Sakwa, who suggested Zelensky could have stopped the war by simply saying Ukraine wouldn't join NATO. Abelow believes the US didn't adequately support Zelensky's initial attempts to negotiate peace, instead focusing on strengthening Ukraine's military and pushing for closer ties with the West. He suggests that this approach ultimately destroyed Ukraine, despite being presented as a way to help it. Abelow makes a bold statement: Ukraine isn't a vital interest for the United States. He acknowledges the tragedy of the war for the Ukrainian people, but argues that from an American perspective, Ukraine is simply not that important. He contrasts this with Russia's view, where Ukraine is seen as crucial to its security, given its long border and history of invasions from the West. He points out that a former U.S. ambassador to Russia, William Burns, warned Washington years ago that Ukraine was a red line for Russia. Abelow concludes with a grim assessment. He believes the West has made a series of foolish and dangerous decisions, putting the world at risk of nuclear war. He quotes another expert, Gilbert Doctorow, who says American lives are now in danger because of this situation. Abelow argues that the only way to avoid disaster is for the U.S. to negotiate with Putin, even if it means making concessions. He paints a picture of leaders stuck in a difficult situation, unable to see the consequences of their actions and potentially leading the world towards catastrophe. He suggests that a combination of American arrogance, short-sightedness, and European weakness has created a truly perilous situation. And that brings us to the end of our summary of this book. I hope you found it insightful and valuable. If you enjoyed this video, hit like and subscribe for more. Your support helps us bring you more great content. Thanks for watching.